The words came out of her husband's mouth in flawless Mandarin, and Adeline felt the champagne flute go cold in her grip. They were seated at the private dining room of Lumiere, one of those restaurants in downtown Toronto, where the waiting list ran 6 months and the lighting was calibrated to make everyone look like they belonged there. Floor-to-ceiling glass. The skyline pressed against the windows like a painting. White tablecloths so stiff they barely moved. Everything composed, elegant, controlled. The man across from her husband was Mr. Chen Wei, a senior partner from a Shanghai investment firm, considering a $40 million stake in Hartwell Capital. This dinner was supposed to close the deal. Adeline had been told to smile, to look interested, and to stay out of the way. She had been doing exactly that. "She's decorative," her husband Jeffrey said in Mandarin, tilting his wine glass slightly in her direction. "Useful for certain situations, events like this. But she doesn't follow the business. Never has." Mr. Chen smiled faintly. He was a careful man in his 60s, the kind who listened more than he spoke. He said nothing. "I married her because she was beautiful and uncomplicated," Jeffrey continued, relaxed, unhurried, the way a man speaks when he's certain no one nearby understands him. That simplicity has its value. At home at least. Adeline set down her champagne, slowly. She made sure her hand did not shake. She had studied Mandarin for 4 years at the University of British Columbia. She had spent a year on exchange in Chengdu. She had worked as a junior interpreter for a trade relations office, before Jeffrey had asked her, gently and then less gently, to step back from her career so she could support his. He said it made more sense. She believed him. He had never once asked whether she spoke Mandarin. Not in 6 years of marriage. He had never asked much about her at all. Mr. Chen glanced at her briefly. She held his gaze for just a moment, long enough for something to pass between them, and then she looked back down at her plate and smiled at nothing. Jeffrey was still talking. He mentioned a woman named Petra, a colleague, he'd always said, someone from the investment side. 2 years, he said to Mr. Chen. She understands what I do in a way my wife never could. We think the same way. Eventually, once the Shanghai deal is finalized and the capital is secured, things will change at home. But for now, appearances matter. Adeline picked up her fork. She took a small, precise bite of her salmon. She chewed, she swallowed. Appearances matter. She had given him 6 years of appearances. 6 years of fundraising dinners and client events and staying quiet in rooms full of people who never learned her name because Jeffrey had already moved on to the next introduction. 6 years of her own ambitions folded into a drawer, politely. She had signed a prenuptial agreement 2 weeks before their wedding. She had been 28 and certain the marriage would last forever, which is the only reason anyone signs something like that without reading every line. Her mother had read it. Her mother, a retired family court clerk from Mississauga, had flagged one clause. Infidelity renders the agreement void. Adeline had told her mother she'd never need that clause. Her mother had said nothing. Silence, she now understood, was a form of love. The dinner continued. Jeffrey and Mr. Chen talked figures, projections, timelines. Adeline smiled when it seemed appropriate. She asked Mr. Chen a question in English about his family, and he answered warmly. At one point Jeffrey leaned over and said quietly, in English, "You don't have to try so hard, darling," and she looked at him and said, "I know," and he thought that was agreement. Near the end of the meal, Jeffrey suggested she head home early. He wanted to continue in the lounge, just the two of them, business talk. He said it kindly. He usually did. Adeline gathered her coat and her bag. She thanked Mr. Chen in English for a wonderful evening. Mr. Chen stood as he had all evening. He was a formal man, but as he shook her hand, he looked at her with an expression that was not quite pity and not quite apology, but something in between. She walked out of Lumiere with her spine straight and her heels quiet on the marble. The valet brought her car around. She sat behind the wheel for a full minute before she started the engine. Then she drove not home but east, across the city, to her friend Rowena's apartment near Leslieville. Rowena Achebe had been her closest friend since their first year at UBC. She was a corporate litigator now, with an office on Bay Street and a reputation for being, as her colleagues put it, surgically precise. She answered the door in leggings and a law school sweatshirt, one look at Adeline's face, and stepped aside without a word. They sat at her kitchen table. Adeline told her everything. The dinner, the Mandarin, what Jeffrey had said about her, what he had said about Petra. Rowena's expression did not change much. She poured 2 cups of tea. She pushed one across the table. The prenup, she said, infidelity clause. My mother flagged it. Does your mother know she's a genius? I think she suspects it. Rowena pulled out a notepad from a kitchen drawer, which was the kind of thing Rowena did. Okay, we need documentation. Everything. His phone, his email, his calendar, anything that establishes the affair as fact and establishes the timeline. Can you get into his accounts? He gave me the passwords years ago, in case of emergencies. Rowena looked at her. This is an emergency. They talked until past midnight. By the time Adeline left, she had a clear sequence of steps in her head. Not a plan born of anger, though the anger was there, running underneath everything like cold water. This was something else. This was clarity. She drove home. The house was dark. Jeffrey's car was in the drive, which meant he hadn't gone to Petra's. He'd just come home as if nothing had happened, because to him, nothing had. Adeline went directly to his study. Her hands didn't shake. She opened his laptop. Same password as always. The emails were not difficult to find. 2 years of them. Careful in some places, careless in others. Hotel bookings under a shared account. Text message screenshots forwarded to himself for reasons she couldn't fathom, except that Jeffrey had always believed he was the smartest person in any room, and people like that sometimes became sloppy with their secrets. They didn't imagine anyone was paying attention. She photographed everything with her phone, the emails, the calendar, a receipt for jewelry she had never received. She opened a new email address and sent it all to herself. Then she found the prenuptial agreement in the fireproof safe beside their passports, photographed every page, put it back exactly where it had been. She was in bed, light off, breathing even, when she heard him come upstairs. He moved quietly. He got in beside her and put his hand briefly on her shoulder. "Love you," he said softly in the dark. She said nothing. She lay still and let him think she was asleep and kept her face completely neutral. In the morning, Jeffrey was gone before she woke. A note on his side of the dresser. Early call with Hong Kong. Back by 7. She made coffee. She went through her normal routine. Then she sat down and accessed their joint accounts. Something she had technically always had the right to do, and had never had occasion to use strategically before. She made careful notes. The checking account, the investment portfolios, the properties. She had contributed $50,000 to Hartwell Capital in the early years of their marriage. Money from her grandmother's estate, offered when the firm was still finding its footing. The contribution was documented. Jeffrey had thanked her and never mentioned it again. She called the number Rowena had given her. "This is Adeline Hartwell. Rowena Achebe referred me. I'd like to arrange a meeting as soon as possible." The voice on the other end was a woman named Frederica Olawole. She was, according to Rowena, the best family law litigator in Ontario. She had a waiting list. She made an exception. Frederica's office was in a building on Adelaide Street, 41st floor, very clean, very calm. She was a tall woman in her early 50s with close-cropped hair and reading glasses pushed up on her head. She looked at Adeline across the table with the particular attention of someone who had heard everything and was not surprised by any of it. "Your initial investment predates the prenup," Frederica said. "After Adeline had laid everything out, you were documented as a capital contributor in the firm's early formation records, not merely as a spousal investor. That's legally distinct. What does that mean in practice? It means the prenup doesn't fully govern that contribution. It means you have a claim to the growth on that investment independent of the marriage itself." Frederica paused. "Hartwell Capital is currently valued at approximately $200 million. Your founding contribution, properly calculated, represents a stake worth roughly $35 to $40 million. The room tilted slightly, the way rooms do when a number that size enters them. "And the infidelity clause? Voids the prenup entirely. You're entitled to equitable division of all marital assets. The investment is additional." Frederica laced her fingers. "There's something else worth noting. Hartwell Capital is in the process of securing a major international investment. If we proceed now, your husband's legal team will move to obscure valuations, complicate disclosures, drag the timeline. If we wait until the Shanghai deal closes and the capital is formally on the books, every number becomes public record." No room to argue. Adeline looked at her. "How long? 4 to 5 months. 4 to 5 months of dinners. Of watching him talk about the Shanghai deal at the kitchen table as if she were a potted plant. Of lying beside him in the dark. What do I need to do?" Frederica told her. "Move money slowly, legally from joint accounts into her own name. Document everything. Keep a record of his movements and his lies. Stay calm. Stay present. Don't change anything in a way that signals what's coming." Adeline nodded. "I can do that." She did. The weeks settled into a quiet double life. During the day, she was the same woman she'd always been, at least to Jeffrey. She attended the charity board meetings she'd been sitting on for years, the ones he never asked about. She had dinner with his colleagues' wives and listened and smiled. She organized their home. She confirmed his travel bookings. At night she moved funds. She updated her records. She photographed High's calendar when it was left open. She noted the nights he came home late, smelling of a perfume she didn't wear. The weekend in October he'd said was a conference in Montreal, when his phone's location had been shared to their tablet by mistake, and she'd seen it was not Montreal at all. She also began doing something she hadn't done in years. She started working again. There was a consultancy she'd been asked to join 3 years earlier and declined, because Jeffrey had said the timing was bad for the family. She reached out to the founder, a woman she'd known from her interpreting days, and explained she was available now. They met for coffee in Kensington Market on a Thursday, and by the end of it she had a project. Cultural brokerage consulting, helping Canadian firms prepare for East Asian markets. Her language skills, her business training, her understanding of how rooms worked across cultures. It was exactly the work she'd set aside. It felt like putting on a coat she'd forgotten she owned. One evening in late November, Jeffrey came home and mentioned that the Shanghai dinner with Mr. Chen's firm had been rescheduled. A second meeting, this time with the full partnership group. He said he wanted Adeline to come. Good for optics. She said of course. The restaurant was a different one this time, a contemporary Japanese place in Yorkville, private dining again. Mr. Chen was there with 2 colleagues from the Shanghai office. Jeffrey was already at the table when Adeline arrived, and he stood to greet her with the practiced warmth he used in rooms full of people he wanted to impress. The introductions were made in English. The first few minutes of conversation were polite and general. Then one of Mr. Chen's colleagues, a younger woman named Miss Fang, made a remark in Mandarin to her partner about the menu. Something light, a comment about the fusion aesthetic, whether it suited the occasion. Adeline answered her in Mandarin, not loudly, not performatively. Just naturally, the way you respond when someone says something in your language. The table went very quiet. Miss Fang looked delighted. She responded, asking Adeline where she had studied. Mr. Chen looked across the table with an expression Adeline read as something close to satisfaction. Jeffrey's face had gone a particular shade she had not seen before. The color of a man who has said things in a room he believed were private, and is now recalculating every assumption he has ever made. He recovered. He tried to. He laughed and said something in English about how she was full of surprises. Adeline smiled at him pleasantly. The dinner was extraordinary after that. She and Miss Fang talked about the cultural dimensions of cross-market investment. She and Mr. Chen discussed the challenges of Canadian firms overestimating familiarity with East Asian business culture. At one point Mr. Chen said to her in Mandarin, "You have a very precise way of explaining complexity." She thanked him and meant it. Jeffrey tried 3 times to steer the conversation back toward himself. Each time, the room drifted gently away. When dessert was cleared and the evening was wrapping up, Ms. Fang exchanged cards with Adeline and said she hoped they would be in contact. Mr. Chen shook Adeline's hand and held it for a moment. "Your husband is fortunate," he said in English, in a tone that suggested he considered this an understatement. In the parking garage afterward, Jeffrey caught up to her at her car. "What was that?" His voice was low. He was trying for controlled and landing somewhere closer to frantic. "Since when do you speak Mandarin? You never said anything." Adeline turned to face him. "You never asked. That's not the point. You sat through meetings, through conversations, you must have heard things." "Yes," she said, "I heard things." He went still. "The dinner at Lumiere," she said. "You and Mr. Chen, you spoke for a long time about me, and about Petra." She watched his face move through several stages. "I've heard a great deal, Jeffrey, for quite some time, Adeline." He said her name carefully, "The way you test ice. I can explain, whatever you think you heard. I don't think, I understood." She pulled her keys from her bag. "I want a divorce, my lawyer will be in touch, the prenup is void. Infidelity clause." She opened her car door. "Your lawyers will explain it to you, you can't just—" He reached for her arm, she looked at his hand, he let go. "I have documentation," she said. "Emails, hotel receipts, calendar records. 2 years of it. My lawyer has copies of all of it." She got in the car. "Good night, Jeffrey." She drove to a hotel on Front Street where she had already booked a suite under her maiden name, Adeline Osi Mensa, the name her mother still used when she called. The room was warm and quiet. She ordered soup from room service and called Rowena. "It's done," she said. "How do you feel?" She thought about it honestly. "Like I set something down that I'd been carrying for a long time." Rowena was quiet for a moment. "Frederica files tomorrow morning. Are you ready?" "I've been ready." She slept soundly, which surprised her, but perhaps shouldn't have. Jeffrey had been served before 9 the next morning. By noon his legal team had called Frederica's office 3 times. By the following week, his first public statement, carefully shaped by his communications director, framed the divorce as mutual and amicable, a word that would have made Adeline laugh if she had seen it. Which she didn't, because she had stopped following his press. The Shanghai deal closed 4 months after the divorce was filed. The $40 million from Mr. Chen's firm came through. making Hartwell Capital's full valuation public and non-negotiable. Frederica filed the amended claim the same week. Jeffrey's legal team argued the investment figure was inflated. The forensic accountant Frederica retained disagreed, in writing, with 90 pages of supporting documentation. The judge was not moved by Jeffrey's team's characterization of Adeline as an opportunistic ex-wife. He noted, with visible impatience, that the documentation of the affair was thorough and the infidelity clause was unambiguous. The settlement took 7 months total. Adeline received her stake in Hartwell Capital, $38 million, plus an equitable share of their marital assets. She received the cottage in Prince Edward County that she had chosen and loved, and that Jeffrey had treated as a weekend inconvenience. She moved into a rented apartment in the annex while she figured out what came next. The apartment had high ceilings and a big kitchen and no one's taste in it but her own. She painted one wall a deep terracotta. She bought plants. She hung things on walls without asking anyone. The consultancy project she'd started in the months before the divorce had, in that time, grown into something she hadn't expected. 2 more clients. A referral from Miss Fang's colleague in Vancouver. A speaking invitation from a trade relations conference in Ottawa, where she talked about cultural fluency in international business, and the specific gap between how Canadian firms imagined East Asian markets and what those markets actually required. Afterward, 3 people came to find her with cards. She hired 1 contractor, then a second. She registered a firm, O.C. Mensa Advisory. Jeffrey, she heard through the peripheral information that reaches you whether you want it or not, had separated from Petra within 6 months of the divorce being finalized. She felt nothing about this. She had stopped being surprised by his choices and had also stopped caring about them, which was not the same thing. In the spring, she got a call from Mr. Chen's office. He was in Toronto for 2 days and would like to have a coffee if she was free. They met at a quiet place on Bloor Street. He was the same measured, courteous man as always. "I owe you an apology," he said, once they were settled. She shook her head. "You don't. At that first dinner, I did not interrupt what your husband said. I was uncertain of the protocol. You were a guest. It wasn't your responsibility. Still." He wrapped his hands around his cup. "I want you to know that I found his comments indefensible. I said as much to my partners afterward. It was one of the reasons we were slow to formalize the agreement." She hadn't known that. "I appreciate you telling me. I have a more practical reason for being here as well." He reached into his jacket and produced a card. "We are bringing a Canadian portfolio under our management. The cross-cultural coordination required is substantial. We need someone who understands both sides. Genuinely." He slid the card across the table. "I thought of you immediately." She looked at the card, then at him. "I'd need to know the scope," she said. "Of course, and I don't work under someone else's structure. I'd bring my firm in as an independent consultant. We expected nothing less." The contract with Mr. Chen's firm was the largest O.C. Mensa Advisory had taken on to date. It required her to bring in 2 more consultants, including a recent UBC graduate who reminded Adeline, somewhat uncomfortably, of herself at 24. She thought about that more than she expected to. She began going to events again. Not Jeffrey's events, not the charity galas where everyone knew her as his wife, but industry conferences, trade forums, panels about women in finance and international business. She was invited to speak more often than she could accept. She learned to say yes to the ones that mattered and no to the ones that didn't, which was itself a skill she had never had the opportunity to develop before. One afternoon she was in her office, a proper office now on Spadina with a small boardroom and a reception area. When her assistant knocked and said her mother was on the line, she picked up. "I saw the article," her mother said, "in the business section. There had been a short profile in the Globe on cross-cultural consulting firms, and O.C. Mensa Advisory had been mentioned." Adeline had not told her mother about it. "You should have told me," her mother said. "I know. You should also know that I am not surprised." Adeline smiled. "I know that too." There was a pause. Her mother was not a woman who used silence carelessly. "That prenup," she said. "I read every line of it." "I know you did. I didn't say anything to you at the time because you were happy and I didn't want to be the person who cast a shadow on that. But I read it, Mom. I just want you to know that I read it because I thought it was my job to read it. Even if you never needed it." Adeline sat quietly for a moment. Outside her window, Spadina was moving in its usual determined way. A streetcar went by. Someone on a bicycle. The ordinary motion of a city that had no idea what any particular person inside it was carrying. "Thank you," she said, "for reading it." Her mother made a small sound that might have been acknowledgement or might have been a warning against getting sentimental. "Are you eating properly?" she asked. "Yes. You were always too thin when you were stressed." "I'm not stressed." "Good." A pause. "Come for dinner Sunday, I'm making jollof." She went. She sat in her mother's kitchen in Mississauga and ate jollof rice and listened to her mother talk about the neighbors and the garden and a documentary she'd watched about migratory birds, and it was the most uncomplicated evening Adeline had spent in longer than she could measure. Driving back into the city afterward, she thought about the woman who had sat at a restaurant table in downtown Toronto and listened to her husband describe her as decorative. She thought about how she had kept her hands still and her expression empty and said nothing, and how at the time she had thought of that as survival. She understood now that it had also been strategy, that the stillness had not been powerlessness, that the silence had been a room she was building, one she moved into when she was ready. Jeffrey had given her a version of herself she didn't recognize, and she had worn it for 6 years without understanding it wasn't hers. The night of the Lumiere dinner, sitting in a parking garage with her engine off and the city humming around her, she had felt something shift. Not break, shift, like something finding its correct position. She had thought, driving to Rowena's that night, that she was going to fight her husband, but she understood now that she had been fighting to come back to herself. OC Mensa Advisory marked its first full year with 12 active clients, 4 full-time staff, and a contract pipeline that had required Adeline to bring on 2 additional senior consultants. She was 34 years old. She owned her firm outright. She spoke Mandarin and French and the particular language of rooms where power is being quietly negotiated, which was the language she had always been fluent in, even when she had been told she wasn't there to speak. On a Thursday evening in late autumn, she stood at her office window and watched the light fall across the city the way it does in October in Toronto, that particular gold that feels like it's apologizing for leaving. Her phone lit up, a message from Miss Fang in Shanghai asking whether she'd be available for a call next week. She typed back, "Yes, looking forward to it." She set the phone down. She looked at the city for another minute. She had nothing left to prove to anyone, which was the only state in which she had ever been capable of doing her best work.